Virginia Hall sat in her gloomy Lyon apartment and listened to the footsteps in the hallway outside her door. It was November 7th, 1942. The footsteps had been getting closer for weeks. Sometimes they stopped at doors on her floor. Sometimes they continued past. Tonight they paused directly outside her apartment. Hall's hand moved to the pistol on the table beside her chair. The footsteps continued down the hall. Hall moved to the window and looked down at the street 4 stories below. 2 men in civilian clothes stood on the corner, smoking cigarettes and watching the building entrance. They'd been there since afternoon. Gestapo most likely, or French milice doing the Gestapo's work. Either way, the net was closing. She'd known this moment would come eventually. 15 months running resistance networks in occupied France, organizing operations under German noses, and the law of averages had finally caught up with her. Someone had talked, probably that priest, Robert Alesh, who'd made contact with her in August, claiming to work with the Paris resistance. She'd had doubts about him from the start. Something in his manner didn't sit right. Too eager, too helpful, asking too many questions about her other contacts. But it wasn't just Alesh. Her entire network felt compromised now. Safe houses that should have been secure were being raided within days of being established. Contacts were disappearing. Messages weren't reaching their destinations. The Germans knew too much, moved too quickly, struck too precisely. Someone was feeding them information, possibly multiple people. Either collaborators had infiltrated her network, or captured agents were breaking under torture and revealing everything they knew. Either way, Hall's network was blown. Every contact she'd built, every safe house she'd established, every operation she'd coordinated was now known to the Gestapo. Staying in Lyon meant certain capture. The Hotel Terminus, Klaus Barbie's headquarters. The Butcher of Lyon commanded Gestapo operations from that elegant building on the Cour Verdun. Barbie had made finding Virginia Hall his personal obsession. He kept a wanted poster on his desk, a sketch artist rendering of her face that was uncomfortably accurate. Someone who knew her had provided that description. The same American woman whose networks he couldn't penetrate, whose agents he couldn't identify, whose operations he couldn't predict or prevent. The Butcher of Lyon, who'd broken hundreds of resistance members under torture, couldn't catch one woman with a limp. The humiliation drove him to fury. He'd increased Gestapo presence in Lyon from 50 agents to 500. He'd pressured Vichy police to cooperate fully or face arrest themselves. He'd personally interrogated suspects, using techniques that left survivors permanently damaged, and he'd told his subordinates that when they finally caught the limping lady, he would handle her interrogation personally. Hall had no illusions about what that meant. She'd attended SOE interrogation training. She knew what the Gestapo did to captured agents, and she knew Barbie's particular reputation for sadistic creativity. Death would be preferable, hence the pistol on her table. She turned from the window and began packing. 1 small bag, anything larger would attract attention. 2 changes of clothing, a first aid kit, emergency rations, her compass and maps of the southern mountain passes, money in French francs and Spanish pesetas, hidden in different pockets in case she was robbed, and the pistol, a small Belgian automatic, 7 rounds, 6 for the Germans if it came to a fight, 1 for herself if capture became inevitable. She wouldn't give Barbie the satisfaction. Her escape plan was desperate, bordering on suicidal. The American consulate had warned her that morning about Operation Torch, an Allied invasion of North Africa launching within hours. The Germans would respond by occupying all of Vichy France immediately. Every border would be sealed. Every train station would have checkpoints. Every road would have patrols, except one route, south to Perpignan near the Spanish border, then across the Pyrenees mountains on foot. 50 miles of winter hiking over passes that reached 7,500 feet elevation. In November, with a wooden leg strapped to her body. Hall looked at Cuthbert, the 8-pound prosthetic she'd worn for 9 years since the hunting accident in Turkey cost her the lower part of her left leg. The wooden peg with its aluminum foot had carried her through 15 months of operations in France. Now it would have to carry her over the Pyrenees, or she'd die trying. She moved through the apartment systematically, destroying evidence. Address books torn into tiny pieces and flushed down the toilet. Coded messages burned in the kitchen sink, ashes washed down the drain. Maps marked with safe houses fed into the fireplace page by page, watching each one curl and blacken before adding the next. She worked methodically, taking her time, ensuring nothing remained that could help the Gestapo hunt down the people who'd worked with her. The radio transmitter went into a trunk under winter clothes. If the Gestapo searched the apartment after she fled, they'd find it eventually, but maybe not immediately. Maybe her networks would have time to scatter before the Germans understood how completely compromised they were. She packed her false papers last. 3 different identities, each with full documentation, identity cards, ration books, travel permits. She chose the papers for Brigitte Lecointe, the journalist cover she'd used since arriving in France. The documents had gotten her through checkpoints before. They'd have to work one more time. Hall checked the street again. The 2 watchers were still there, but they hadn't been reinforced. Good. They were waiting for her to lead them to other resistance members. They didn't realize she was preparing to run. She put on her coat, picked up her bag, and took one last look at the apartment that had been her base for over a year. The gloomy space, with its hidden maps, concealed codes, and buried transmitter. The place where she'd planned operations, coordinated networks, and somehow survived longer than anyone expected. She turned off the lights, leaving the radio playing softly to suggest she'd return. Then she walked out of apartment 314 for the last time, unsure whether she'd even make it to the street, let alone to Spain. How did an American woman with a wooden leg become the Gestapo's most wanted agent? What had she done to earn Klaus Barbie's obsession? And could she possibly survive 50 miles through winter mountains when even experienced mountaineers considered the crossing nearly suicidal? Virginia Hall was born on April 6, 1906, on a small farm outside Baltimore, Maryland. Her family had money, not enormous wealth, but comfortable prosperity built on banking and investments. That wealth meant Virginia had opportunities most American women didn't. She could attend the best schools, travel to Europe, and pursue dreams beyond marriage and motherhood. Her father, Edwin Lee Hall, worked in banking and theater management. Her mother, Barbara Virginia Hamill, came from a prominent Maryland family. They raised Virginia and her younger brother John in a household that valued education, independence, and adventure. Edwin particularly encouraged his daughter's ambitions. He took her hunting in the Maryland forests, teaching her to track game, read weather signs, and navigate by stars and landmarks. Those skills, learned in peaceful woods, would later keep her alive in occupied France. She attended Roland Park Country School, an exclusive preparatory academy for girls. Her classmates remembered her as intelligent, athletic, and utterly uninterested in conventional expectations. She was class president, captain of the hockey team, and editor of the school newspaper. She wore her hair short when fashion demanded long curls. She expressed opinions forcefully when young women were expected to remain demure and agreeable. One often repeated story claimed she once arrived at school wearing a bracelet made of live garter snakes, just to see how the other girls would react. Whether the story was true or exaggerated, it captured something essential about Virginia Hall's character. She did things because they interested her, not because they were appropriate or expected. After graduating from Roland Park, Hall attended Radcliffe College for 2 years, then transferred to Barnard College in New York City. She studied languages with intensity bordering on obsession: French, German, Italian, and eventually enough Russian to conduct basic conversations. She had discovered she had an ear for languages, the ability to hear subtle differences in pronunciation and reproduce them accurately. By graduation, she spoke French well enough to pass for a native of Alsace, German with a Viennese accent, and Italian that could place her anywhere from Milan to Rome. She had one goal: join the United States Foreign Service and see the world as a diplomat. In the 1920s and early 30s, the Foreign Service was almost exclusively male. Women could work as clerks and secretaries, but diplomatic positions were closed to them by custom and policy. Hall didn't care about policy. She'd spent her life ignoring rules that didn't make sense. After Barnard, Hall traveled to Europe for additional study. She attended the Sorbonne in Paris, studied economics in Vienna, and spent time in Germany watching the rise of the Nazi Party with growing alarm. She returned to the United States in 1929, applied to the State Department, and was hired as a consular clerk, not the diplomatic position she wanted, but clerks could eventually take the Foreign Service exam. It was a start. In 1931, the State Department assigned Hall to the American Embassy in Warsaw, Poland. She worked in the consular section, processing visa applications and handling routine paperwork. The work was tedious, but Warsaw in 1931 was fascinating. The city stood at the crossroads of Europe, filled with diplomats, spies, refugees, and political agitators. Hall attended diplomatic receptions, practiced her languages, and built relationships with people who would remember her later. In 1932, she transferred to the consulate in Izmir, Turkey. The posting was considered hardship duty, hot, isolated, and far from the centers of power in Ankara or Istanbul. But Hall liked Izmir. She had more responsibility, more interaction with local officials, and more opportunity to demonstrate competence. On a December morning in 1933, Hall decided to go hunting for snipe in the hills outside Izmir. She was 27 years old and an experienced hunter. She'd been shooting since childhood, taught by her father in the woods around Baltimore. She knew weapons safety, knew to keep her finger off the trigger while climbing obstacles, knew all the rules that prevented accidents. Knowledge didn't save her. She climbed a wooden fence while holding her 12-gauge shotgun. Somehow she would never be entirely certain how the weapon discharged. The muzzle was pointed at her left foot. The blast hit at point-blank range, destroying everything below the ankle. Bones shattered, blood vessels severed, tissue vaporized by the blast. Local Turkish doctors tried to save the foot. They cleaned the wound, removed bone fragments, and sutured what remained. But infection set in within 48 hours. The wound turned red, then purple, then black, gangrene. Death spreading up her leg, killing tissue 1 inch at a time, releasing toxins into her bloodstream that would kill her within days if the leg wasn't removed. Army surgeons at the American hospital in Istanbul performed the amputation. They took her leg below the knee, cutting through healthy tissue well above the infection to ensure they removed everything. Hall woke up from surgery to find 8 inches of her left leg simply gone, replaced by bandages and empty space. The doctors fitted her with a wooden prosthetic 6 weeks later, after the stump had healed enough to bear weight. The device was crude by modern standards, a wooden peg with an aluminum foot attached to her leg by leather straps that wrapped around her thigh and connected to a belt at her waist. The ankle didn't flex. The knee worked normally because she still had her own knee, but the rigid ankle meant she had to swing the entire leg forward from the hip with each step. Walking on flat ground was manageable with practice. Stairs were dangerous. Running was impossible. Hall named the prosthetic Cuthbert after Saint Cuthbert of Lindisfarne, a 7th century hermit who lived alone on a rocky island off the coast of England. The saint had survived through faith, determination, and sheer stubbornness, qualities Hall would need to survive with her new companion. She returned to work at the consulate in Venice in 1934, determined to continue her diplomatic career. She learned to walk without a noticeable limp by adjusting her gait, taking shorter steps, and compensating with her hip and back muscles. The compensation caused chronic pain, but she considered pain preferable to sympathy or pity. In 1937, Hall applied for a diplomatic position with the Foreign Service. She'd passed the written exam years earlier. Her language skills were exceptional. Her performance reviews were excellent. Her superiors recommended her advancement. The application should have been routine approval. The State Department sent a formal rejection. Policy prohibited hiring individuals with amputations or physical disabilities for diplomatic positions. No exceptions, no appeals. The policy existed, therefore it would be enforced. Hall appealed directly to President Franklin Roosevelt. She wrote a detailed letter explaining her qualifications, her experience, and her determination to serve her country. Roosevelt's staff responded with a form letter. The president appreciated her interest in government service, but personnel decisions were made by individual departments. The State Department's decision was final. In March 1939, Virginia Hall resigned from the State Department. She was 33 years old, with no career prospects and a wooden leg that hurt every time she walked. Most women in her position would have returned to Maryland, married someone appropriate from her social circle, and settled into comfortable domestic life. Virginia Hall went to Paris. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Hall was living in France. She immediately volunteered for the Service de Santé des Armées, the French Army Medical Corps. They made her an ambulance driver. The work was dangerous, driving toward gunfire instead of away from it, but Hall had something to prove, to herself, to the State Department that rejected her, to everyone who assumed her disability, disqualified her from serving. For 9 months she drove wounded soldiers from the front lines to field hospitals, working 18-hour shifts through the bitter winter of 1939 and the spring of 1940. She drove through snowstorms, on icy roads, under artillery fire. She learned to change tires while shells exploded nearby. She learned to navigate without headlights during blackouts. She learned that she could function under pressure that broke stronger people. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched Fall Gelb, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. 135 divisions of Wehrmacht forces crashed through the Ardennes forest, bypassing the Maginot Line entirely. The French army, which had spent 20 years preparing for a replay of World War I's trench warfare, collapsed in confusion and panic. Hall drove her ambulance through the chaos of the French retreat. Roads jammed with military vehicles, mixed with civilian refugees fleeing the advance. German Stukas dive-bombed the columns, machine gunning anything that moved. Hall kept driving, evacuating wounded men who would have died without immediate medical treatment. By June 14th, German forces entered Paris. The French government fled first to Bordeaux, then to Vichy. On June 22nd, France signed an armistice at Compiègne, in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed the armistice ending World War I. The symbolism was deliberate and humiliating. Germany divided France into zones. The northern zone, including Paris and the entire Atlantic coast, would be directly occupied by German military forces. The southern zone would be governed by the Vichy regime under Marshal Philippe Pétain, theoretically independent but actually a German puppet state. Alsace and Lorraine were annexed directly into the Reich. A forbidden zone along the Belgian border was closed entirely to French civilians. Hall escaped south through Spain to England. She arrived in London in July 1940 with her ambulance driving experience, her language fluency, and a burning determination to fight back against the Germans who'd conquered France. She had no contacts, no job prospects, and no clear plan, but she had a phone number given to her by a friend before leaving France. "Call this number when you reach England," the friend had said. "They can use people like you." Hall called the number. A man with a cultured British accent answered. Where had she gotten this number? What were her qualifications? Could she come to an address in Baker Street for an interview? The address turned out to be the headquarters of the Special Operations Executive, Churchill's secret army created to set Europe ablaze through sabotage, espionage, and support for resistance movements. The interview was conducted by Nicholas Bodington, an officer with F Section, the part of SOE that handled operations in France. Bodington looked at Hall's file and saw someone extraordinary. American citizenship meant the Vichy government wouldn't automatically suspect her of working for Britain. Her fluent French and intimate knowledge of the country made her ideal for undercover work. Her disability made her memorable, which was normally disqualifying for espionage work. But Bodington had read reports from her ambulance driving supervisors. She'd operated under fire without panic, made good decisions under pressure, and earned the trust of French soldiers who initially resented taking orders from an American woman. The SOE was desperate. Since its creation in July 1940, the organization had struggled to infiltrate agents into France. The few agents they'd managed to insert had mostly been captured or killed. The casualty rate was approaching 50%. FEC section needed experienced people who could survive in hostile territory. Bodington made his decision. He offered Hall a position as a field agent. She would be the first woman SOE sent into occupied France as a resident agent, not just a courier or radio operator. Her mission: establish networks, recruit resistance members, gather intelligence, coordinate operations, and somehow survive in a country filled with German soldiers, Gestapo agents, and French collaborators. Hall accepted immediately. When did she start training? The training was brutal. Weapons handling at a facility in Scotland, learning to field strip and reassemble pistols, submachine guns, and rifles. Explosives training, calculating blast radii, and learning to wire detonators. lock-picking and safe-cracking, spending hours manipulating pins and tumblers until she could open locks by feel in complete darkness, codes and ciphers, memorizing encryption systems and practicing until she could encode messages without conscious thought. The worst part was interrogation resistance training. SOE instructors subjected trainees to realistic simulations of Gestapo interrogation. They used stress positions, sleep deprivation, and controlled amounts of pain to test how long trainees could resist. Hall learned that everyone breaks eventually. The goal wasn't to resist forever. That was impossible. The goal was to resist long enough for networks to disperse, contacts to disappear, and operational information to become worthless. They taught her to compartmentalize, know only what you need to know, tell contacts only what they need to know, build networks in cells where capture of one cell doesn't compromise the others, trust no one completely, always have an escape plan, always have a backup to the backup plan. The SOE gave Hall multiple identities with forged papers for each. Her primary cover would be Brigitte Lecointe, an American journalist working as a stringer for the New York Post. The cover was perfect. It gave her legitimate reasons to travel, ask questions, and meet people. Journalists were expected to be curious, to pry into things others preferred to keep private, and American journalists had some protection. The United States was still neutral in 1941. Vichy authorities would be cautious about arresting American citizens without clear evidence of espionage. On August 23, 1941, Virginia Hall crossed into Vichy France, carrying forged papers, a small suitcase, and orders to build resistance networks in the most dangerous territory in Europe. She was 35 years old, traveling alone, with a wooden leg and instructions that basically amounted to improvise, survive, and send intelligence reports when possible. The SOE didn't expect her to survive more than a few weeks. One officer told her directly that life expectancy for field agents in France was measured in months at best. The Gestapo was good at finding spies. The Abwehr was better. French collaborators were everywhere. One mistake, one suspicious contact, one person who talked under torture, and she'd be arrested, interrogated, and executed. Hall smiled and told him she'd try to beat the odds. Then she crossed the border and disappeared into France. She would stay for 15 months and become a legend. Hall established her base in Lyon, the second largest city in France and the heart of the resistance movement. Lyon stood at the confluence of the Rhône and Saône rivers, a major transportation hub connecting northern and southern France. The city had a tradition of independence dating back centuries. The people were proud, stubborn, and inclined to resist authority they considered illegitimate, perfect territory for building resistance networks. Hall rented a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood where no one asked too many questions. She established her cover as a journalist, registering with the Vichy authorities and filing occasional stories back to the New York Post. The stories were real journalism, interviews with local officials, observations about daily life under occupation, nothing that compromised operational security. The Post actually published some of them, which strengthened her cover. Meanwhile, Hall began building what the SOE called the Heckler Network. Her methods were meticulous and paranoid. She never met contacts in the same place twice. She used dead drops for messages, prearranged locations where one person could leave information for another without direct contact. She established safe houses across the city and surrounding countryside, each one known to only a few people. She recruited carefully, avoiding anyone who seemed careless with security or who boasted about their activities. Her first major recruit was Suzanne Berton, a sophisticated French woman with connections across southern France. Berton established a sub-network of 90 agents who provided intelligence on German military installations, supply depots, and troop movements. The intelligence was extraordinarily detailed: exact locations of ammunition bunkers, precise numbers of soldiers in garrison, specific dates when supply convoys would pass through particular towns. Hall also worked with Madame Guérin, who owned a brothel in Lyon that served German officers. The arrangement was practical and profitable. German officers with time, money, and loosened inhibitions talked freely around the women who entertained them. Those women reported everything to Madame Guérin, who passed the information to Hall. Some of the best intelligence on German operations came from pillow talk overheard in a Lyon brothel. The American consulate in Lyon provided Hall with crucial support. The consul, George Whittinghill, was sympathetic to the Allied cause despite American neutrality. He allowed Hall to use the diplomatic pouch to send reports to London. The pouch was sealed and immune from French or German inspection under international law. Hall's intelligence reports traveled from Lyon to the State Department in Washington, then to the British Embassy, and finally to SOE headquarters in London. Slow but secure, downed British airmen who managed to evade capture were told by resistance members to go to the American consulate in Lyon and ask for Olivier. Olivier was Virginia Hall's code name. She hid pilots in safe houses, provided them with civilian clothes and false identity papers, and arranged their escape to neutral Spain. From Spain, they could return to England and fly again. Hall personally helped dozens of pilots escape. Several of them returned to France later as SOE agents themselves, leading their own networks. The French quickly learned about La Dame qui boite, the lady who limps. The nickname was dangerous but inevitable. Hall couldn't hide her distinctive gait, so she used it strategically. She varied her appearance constantly, changing hair color and style, wearing different types of clothing, altering how she walked by adjusting Cuthbert straps to change the angle of her gait. Sometimes she exaggerated the limp to play on people's sympathy. A disabled woman was less threatening, less likely to be a spy. Other times she minimized it, wearing long skirts that concealed her leg movements. The Germans also heard about the limping lady. German intelligence officers collected reports from informants about an American woman, possibly a journalist, who walked with a noticeable limp and seemed to know everyone in Lyon. The reports were vague and contradictory, but they suggested someone worth investigating. The Gestapo added her to their watch list. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, Hall coordinated one of the most audacious operations of the war. 12 SOE agents were imprisoned at Mauzac prison in the Dordogne region of southern France. The men had been captured during various operations and were awaiting transfer to German-controlled territory for interrogation. Once transferred, they would be tortured for information, then executed. The SOE desperately wanted them back, not just for their sake, but because several of them knew enough about SOE operations to compromise networks across France if they broke under interrogation. Hall received orders from London. Get them out. No specific plan, no detailed instructions, just the objective and authorization to use any resources necessary. She made contact with Gabby Bloch, wife of one of the imprisoned men. Bloch visited the prison regularly, bringing food and supplies. Hall recruited her to smuggle tools hidden inside tins of sardines. The tins had false bottoms that concealed small files, hacksaw blades, and bits of wire. Prison guards searched visitors carefully, but they opened food tins randomly, rather than checking every one. Most of the smuggled tools made it through. The prisoners used the tools to make a key to their barracks door. The work took weeks, filing metal scraps into the precise shape needed to manipulate the lock's pins. One prisoner, Georges Béguet, was a wireless operator. A sympathetic priest smuggled a small radio transmitter into the prison. Hidden in a basket of food, Béguet began transmitting to London from inside the prison itself, coordinating the escape plan with SOE headquarters. Hall assembled the external support. She established safe houses where the escaped prisoners could hide immediately after leaving the prison. She acquired vehicles, stolen cars with forged registration papers. She recruited helpers who would drive the prisoners away from the area. She even obtained 2 French police uniforms that could be used if the escapees needed to bluff their way through checkpoints. On July 15, 1942, all 12 prisoners walked out of Mauzac. The escape was almost comically simple. They unlocked their barracks door after midnight, walked across the prison yard, climbed over a wall using a rope made from braided bedsheets, and disappeared into the countryside. The guards didn't discover they were missing until morning roll call. The French police and Gestapo launched a massive manhunt. Roadblocks went up across the Dordogne. Patrols searched every town, every farm, every building where fugitives might hide, but the 12 men had scattered immediately, heading to different safe houses Hall had prepared. They moved at night, hidden during the day, using escape routes Hall had scouted personally weeks earlier. By August 11th, all 12 men reached Lyon, where Hall organized their final escape to Spain. They traveled in small groups, using different routes, never all together where one betrayal could capture them all. Every man made it back to England safely. M.R.D. Foote, the official SOE historian who wrote the classified history of the organization after the war, called the Mauzac escape one of the war's most useful operations of its kind. Several of the escaped agents returned to France later and became leaders of major resistance networks. The operation was a masterpiece of planning, coordination, and execution. It also sealed Virginia Hall's fate. The Gestapo was humiliated. 12 prisoners escaping under their noses suggested either spectacular incompetence or a sophisticated organization operating with impunity. They chose to believe the latter because believing they were incompetent was intolerable to Nazi self-image. Klaus Barbie took personal command of the investigation. The Butcher of Lyon was arguably the most dangerous man in France, a true believer in Nazi ideology who enjoyed inflicting pain and saw torture as an art form to be perfected. Barbie studied the Mauzac escape methodically. The sophistication suggested British intelligence, specifically SOE. The coordination suggested a single person running the operation from Lyon. Reports from informants mentioned the American journalist who limped. Barbie ordered 500 additional Gestapo agents into the unoccupied zone. The SD, the SS Intelligence Service, and the Abwehr both increased their operations. Their focus centered on Lyon. Find the limping lady. Find everyone who worked with her. Break the networks. Make examples of the leaders. Hall had always relied on contacts within the French police to warn her of German operations. After the Mauzac escape, those contacts became unreliable. The Germans pressured the Vichy police relentlessly. Collaborate fully or face arrest yourselves. Most police chose collaboration. Survival trumped resistance. In August 1942, Hall made contact with a Catholic priest named Robert Alesh. He claimed to work with the Gloria Network, a Paris-based resistance movement. He offered intelligence of apparently high value, details about German operations, names of collaborators, information that seemed too specific to be fabrication. Hall was suspicious. Something about Alesh didn't feel right. When she learned that Gloria had been infiltrated and destroyed by German intelligence, her suspicions deepened. But Alesh was convincing, and Hall's superiors in London believed he was legitimate. They pressured her to work with him. Alesh was Abwehr. He'd infiltrated Gloria specifically to identify its leaders and connections to other networks. When he made contact with Hall, he reported everything to his German handlers. Her safe houses, her contacts, her methods. The Gestapo placed her photograph on wanted posters, distributed across southern France. The sketch artist's rendering was remarkably accurate. Someone who knew her had described her face in detail. Klaus Barbie kept one of the wanted posters on his desk. He told subordinates that the woman who organized the Mauzac escape would be caught, broken, and killed as an example. Barbie had already executed dozens of resistance members personally. He considered breaking captured agents a professional challenge. How long could someone resist? What techniques were most effective? Hall would be a particularly satisfying capture. American, woman, disabled, arrogant enough to run operations under German noses. Barbie wanted her badly. On November 7, 1942, the American consulate contacted Hall with urgent news. The Allies were launching Operation Torch, an invasion of North Africa. The Germans would respond by occupying all of Vichy France immediately. The window for escape was closing. Get out now, or don't get out at all. Hall made her decision within minutes. She would go south to the Spanish border. The Germans controlled the roads and trains, so she'd have to be extraordinarily careful. But once she reached Perpignan near the border, she could arrange passage over the mountains with smugglers she'd worked with before. The problem was the mountains themselves. The Pyrenees in winter were a death trap for experienced mountaineers with proper equipment. For a woman with a wooden leg, they were essentially suicide. But suicide attempting escape beat certain death in Gestapo headquarters. Hall didn't tell anyone her plans. She packed a small bag and caught the night train to Perpignan. Behind her, the footsteps kept coming. The Germans were hunting the most dangerous spy in France, but Virginia Hall was already gone. The train from Lyon to Perpignan took Hall through the heart of Vichy France. Every station had Gestapo agents checking papers. Every carriage had informants watching passengers. Hall's American passport and journalist credentials got her through the checkpoints, but the agents looked at her carefully. Red hair and a limp matched the description on their wanted posters. Each inspection took longer than the last. Questions became more detailed. Where are you going? Why? Who will you meet there? What stories are you working on? Hall had prepared cover stories for every question. She was traveling to Perpignan to interview local officials about agricultural production in the south. She planned to write a series on how France was adapting to wartime conditions. She had letters of introduction from officials in Lyon. Everything checked out on paper, but the Germans weren't stupid. They knew American journalists could be spies. They knew someone matching Hall's description was their most wanted target. The agents made notes on her passport. They would send reports to Perpignan. Local authorities would be waiting when she arrived. Hall understood this. She'd worked in intelligence long enough to recognize the pattern. The Germans weren't arresting her on the train because they wanted to follow her to contacts in Perpignan. Standard surveillance technique: let the target lead you to bigger fish. She arrived in Perpignan at dawn on November 8, 1942. German forces were already moving into southern France in response to Operation Torch. Hall could see military convoys on roads paralleling the railway, troops, trucks, tanks, all heading south. Within 24 hours, the occupation would be complete. Every route out of France would be sealed. Hall walked directly from the train station to the town square. No surveillance detection, no counter-surveillance, no evasive maneuvers. She wanted the Germans to think she was behaving normally, unaware they were watching. At the square, between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, she met a man named Gilbert. Gilbert specialized in arranging illegal crossings into Spain. Before the war, he'd been a small-time smuggler, moving tobacco and luxury goods across the border. When war came, his business expanded dramatically. Refugees, escaped prisoners of war, Jews fleeing deportation, downed airmen. Everyone needed routes across the Pyrenees. Gilbert knew the mountain passes intimately. He employed Basque shepherds, who made the crossing regularly. When Hall explained what she needed, Gilbert was doubtful. The crossing required 3 days of hard walking over terrain that challenged experienced mountaineers. The passes reached 7,500 feet in elevation. In November, that meant deep snow, ice on the rocks, and temperatures that dropped below 0 Fahrenheit at night. Most of his guides refused to take women. An amputee would be impossible. Hall showed him Cuthbert. She'd been walking on it for 9 years. She was strong, experienced with mountains from hiking in Maryland and the Alps, and desperate enough to try anyway. She offered to pay triple the normal fee. Money talked louder than doubts. Gilbert agreed to ask his guides. He couldn't promise anything. If they said no, Hall would have to find another route. But Gilbert suspected there was no other route. The Germans were sealing the border. Perpignan would be crawling with Gestapo agents within hours. If Hall stayed in the city, she'd be arrested by nightfall. The guides were 2 Basque shepherds named Jean and Pierre. They spoke minimal French and no English. Their knowledge of the mountains came from decades of working in them, not from maps or training. They knew which passes were manageable in winter and which were death traps. They knew where Spanish patrols operated and where gaps in coverage allowed smugglers through. When Gilbert explained that Hall wanted to cross, they said no immediately. A woman with 1 leg? Impossible. She'd slow them down. She might fall and injure herself seriously. They'd have to carry her, which would leave them vulnerable to Spanish patrols who wouldn't hesitate to shoot smugglers. Better to refuse the job entirely. Hall met them personally that afternoon. She walked for them, demonstrating her gait and balance. She showed them that Cuthbert was sturdy wood and metal, not some fragile prosthetic that would break under stress. She explained she'd been a hunter in America, comfortable with wilderness and rough terrain, and she offered them money, triple the normal rate, paid in advance, with a bonus if they got her to Spain alive. Jean and Pierre conferred in Basque. The money was tempting. Their families needed it, But if the woman died on the mountain, they'd feel responsible. American money couldn't buy absolution for leaving a body in the snow. Hall told them directly, if she died, it would be her choice and her failure. She understood the risks. She was going anyway, with guides or without. If they refused, she'd attempt the crossing alone, which would certainly end in death. At least with guides, she had a chance. The pragmatism convinced them. Better they take her money and try, than refuse and watch her die attempting it alone. They agreed. Leave tonight. The crossing would take 3 days if all went well, possibly 4 if weather turned bad. Bring warm clothes, good boots, and minimal baggage. Everything else stays behind. Hall sent a coded message to SOE headquarters before departing. Standard procedure: let London know she was attempting escape so they could prepare for her arrival in Spain. She mentioned she hoped Cuthbert wouldn't give her too much trouble on the crossing. The reply came back within hours. If Cuthbert troublesome, eliminate him. The SOE thought Cuthbert was a person, possibly an informant or a compromised contact. The miscommunication became famous in intelligence circles after the war as one of the most unintentionally humorous mistakes of the conflict. Hall filed the message away and prepared to leave. The crossing began after dark on November 9th. Hall and her 2 guides left Perpignan on foot, walking north into the foothills. They traveled at night initially, avoiding German and French patrols that operated near the city. The first section followed established trails through forests and past small farms. Jane set a brutal pace. He wanted to reach the mountains proper by dawn, putting distance between them and patrols. Hall discovered immediately that hiking with Cuthbert was different from walking on city streets. Every step required conscious effort. Swing the leg forward from the hip, plant the aluminum foot carefully on uneven ground, shift weight, repeat. On flat ground it was manageable if exhausting. On slopes, each step became a battle against gravity, balance, and a prosthetic that couldn't flex to absorb impact. By midnight, her stump was bleeding. The leather straps that held Cuthbert to her body chafed despite layers of bandaging. Hall felt warmth soaking through the bandages, but said nothing. Complaining wouldn't change anything. Either she made it over the mountains, or she didn't. Blood was unpleasant, but not immediately life-threatening. They reached Villefranche-de-Conflent just before dawn. The fortified town sat at the entrance to the mountain valleys. From here, trails led up toward the high passes used by smugglers. Jean and Pierre knew dozens of routes. They chose the one they judged safest for November weather, Col de Tivoli, a pass at 7,500 feet that offered protection from the worst winds. They rested briefly in an abandoned barn outside the town. Jean checked Hall's leg and frowned at the blood on her bandages. He offered to cancel the crossing and return to Perpignan. She'd never make it 3 days with her stump already damaged. Hall refused. Perpignan meant capture. The crossing might kill her, but capture certainly would, just more slowly and painfully. She rewrapped her stump with fresh bandages from her pack, tightened Cuthbert's straps, and told them to continue. The second day was climbing. The trails grew steeper as they ascended toward the pass. Hall developed a rhythm, 3 steps with her good leg, dragging Cuthbert behind for balance, then 1 full step with Cuthbert planted firmly, slow but steady. Jean and Pierre adjusted their pace to match hers. They'd misjudged her. Most clients collapsed within hours, begging to turn back. Hall just kept walking, face set with determination, never asking for breaks. Snow started in the early afternoon. Not gentle flakes, but driving snow pushed by wind that screamed through the peaks. Visibility dropped to a few dozen yards. Temperature plummeted. Hall wore every layer she'd brought, but it wasn't enough. The cold penetrated through clothing, through skin, into bones and joints that ached with every movement. Climbing in snow with Cuthbert tested the absolute limits of what Hall could endure. The wooden leg couldn't flex to grip the slope. She had to kick steps into the snow with her good leg, then drag Cuthbert up behind, using her arms and back to haul herself forward. The aluminum foot provided no traction on ice. She fell repeatedly, caught herself with her hands, and kept climbing. Jean and Pierre watched her with something approaching awe. They'd taken dozens of refugees across the mountains. None had endured this kind of punishment without complaint or tears. The stump became a source of constant agony by late afternoon. Every step sent pain shooting up her leg into her hip and back. The leather straps had rubbed her skin raw despite fresh bandages. Blood soaked through multiple layers. But Hall had learned pain management in SOE training. Acknowledge the pain, compartmentalize it, continue functioning. Pain meant damage, but not necessarily failure. Only unconsciousness or physical inability to move meant failure. They reached the summit of the pass in late afternoon on November 10th. The wind at 7,500 feet was so strong, it knocked Hall down twice. She crawled the last 100 yards to a shepherd's hut Jean knew about, partially buried in snow but still standing. They broke in and huddled inside for warmth. The hut had no heat. Fire would draw attention from patrols, but the stone walls blocked the wind. Jean had brought emergency rations, hard bread, dried meat, a little cheese. They ate in silence, too exhausted for conversation. Hall removed Cuthbert for the first time since leaving Perpignan. The stump was a horror. Blisters covered every surface. The skin was raw and bleeding where the leather straps had rubbed through multiple layers. The wounds were starting to show signs of infection, redness spreading, swelling, heat that suggested bacteria multiplying. Jean examined the damage and told Hall bluntly that continuing was insane. She'd cripple herself permanently. The infections could spread to her bloodstream, causing sepsis that would kill her within days. Even if she survived the crossing, she'd need serious medical treatment immediately upon reaching Spain. Hall cleaned the wounds with water from melted snow, applied antiseptic ointment from her first aid kit, and wrapped the stump with the last of her bandages. Then she put Cuthbert back on and told them they were continuing at dawn. Jean asked her why. Why push herself this hard? She was already in Spain, technically. The border ran along the ridge above them. She could surrender to Spanish border guards and claim asylum as an American citizen. Yes, she'd spend time in Spanish prisons, but she wouldn't die on the mountain. Hall explained simply, she had work to do. The war wasn't over. Amasoe needed experienced agents. People were dying because there weren't enough operatives running networks in France. She'd rest when the war ended, not before. The descent began the next morning. Going downhill was worse than climbing. Every step drove the full weight of her body forward into Cuthbert. The wooden leg couldn't absorb shock the way a natural ankle would. Every impact jarred through her stump into her hip and back. Hall felt something tear in her stump, probably damaged muscle tissue, giving way under stress. The pain became blinding. She vomited from the intensity, then continued walking. She developed a technique of sitting and sliding down steep sections, pushing herself backward with her good leg, dragging Cuthbert beside her. It was slow and undignified and left her clothing torn and filthy, but it worked. Progress measured in yards became progress measured in miles. They spent the second night in another abandoned hut, this one on the Spanish side of the border, well below the pass. Jean and Pierre were more relaxed. The worst was over. Spanish patrols were less aggressive than German units. As long as they avoided the main roads and official crossings, they should reach a town safely. On the morning of November 11th, they descended toward the valley. Hall could see the French town of Mentet in the distance behind them, a landmark that confirmed they'd crossed in the right place. Ahead lay Camprodon, a Spanish town about 10 miles down the mountain, where they could catch a train to Barcelona. The final descent took all day. Hall's stump was beyond pain now. Nerve endings had been so thoroughly damaged that she felt mostly numbness, punctuated by occasional spikes of agony. She walked mechanically, one step at a time, not thinking about the distance remaining, just the next step and then the next. They reached Camprodon at 4:30 in the morning on November 12th, 90 minutes before the 5:45 train to Barcelona. Too early. The guides wanted to wait at the station. The early morning train wasn't heavily controlled by Spanish authorities. Refugees often used it to slip into cities where they could disappear. Jean and Pierre made a fatal mistake. A group of exhausted, dirty travelers with minimal luggage, arriving from the mountains before dawn, Spanish Guardia Civil spotted them within minutes. Obviously illegal border crossers. The guards arrested all of them without questions and took them to the local jail. Hall spent 6 weeks in Spanish custody. Spain under Francisco Franco was officially neutral, but sympathetic to Germany. Spanish authorities often returned refugees to German custody, especially if those refugees were suspected of espionage. Hall's American citizenship offered some protection. Spain wanted to maintain good relations with the United States, but not immunity from arrest. The conditions in Spanish jails were brutal. Overcrowding, minimal food, no medical care. Hall's stump became seriously infected. Without antibiotics, the infection spread. She developed a fever that left her delirious for days. Other prisoners thought she would die. She probably would have died if an inmate being released hadn't gotten word to the American consulate in Barcelona about an American woman in prison claiming to be a journalist. American officials applied pressure on Spanish authorities. Virginia Hall was an American citizen arrested for the minor crime of illegal border crossing. She should be released immediately. Spain, wanting to avoid diplomatic complications with America, agreed. Hall walked out of Spanish prison in late December 1942. She was emaciated, her stump was infected, and she'd lost nearly 20 pounds. But she was free, and in Allied-friendly territory. She could get medical treatment, recover, and return to work. Her first message to SOE headquarters was simple: send her back to France. She had unfinished business with Klaus Barbie. In January 1943, Hall returned to London for debriefing, medical treatment, and rest. Doctors at a military hospital examined her stump and told her she'd done permanent damage. The infection had destroyed tissue that would never regenerate. The blisters and abrasions had left scar tissue that would make wearing Cuthbert painful for the rest of her life. They recommended extensive rest and possibly retirement from field operations. Hall told them to treat the infection and clear her for duty. Rest could wait until after the war ended. The doctors prescribed antibiotics and insisted on 6 weeks of recovery. Hall spent the time at SOE headquarters in Baker Street, debriefing officers on her 15 months in France. She provided detailed reports on every network she'd built, every operation she'd coordinated, every German installation her agents had identified. The reports filled hundreds of pages and gave SOE unprecedented intelligence on conditions in occupied France. In March 1943, King George VI presented Hall with the Member of the Order of the British Empire in a quiet ceremony at Buckingham Palace. The honor recognized her work in France, though the specific details remained classified. Hall attended the ceremony, wearing a simple dress that concealed Cuthbert. She accepted the medal with appropriate gratitude, then asked when she could return to France. Maurice Buckmaster, head of F Section, told her no. Hall was too compromised. Every German agent in France had her description. The wanted posters showed her face. Klaus Barbie had made capturing her a personal mission. Going back would be suicide within weeks, possibly days. Hall argued for 3 months. She presented logical arguments about operational security, detailed plans for operating under deep cover, and proposals for new networks built from scratch with no connections to her previous work. She pointed out that her experience made her more valuable than 10 inexperienced agents. She'd proven she could survive in hostile territory. Cuthbert was a disadvantage but not disqualifying. Buckmaster refused every argument. The decision wasn't about Hall's capabilities. Everyone acknowledged she was extraordinary. The decision was about acceptable risk. SOE couldn't sacrifice its most experienced agent on a mission that would probably end in capture. The organization needed Hall alive, even if she was stuck in London writing reports and training new agents. In June 1943, Hall contacted the American Office of Strategic Services. The OSS was America's new intelligence agency, created in June 1942 and modeled partly on SOE. General William Wild Bill Donovan commanded it. Donovan was building an organization from nothing, trying to establish operations across Europe, Africa, and Asia simultaneously. Hall offered the OSS something they desperately needed: an experienced agent who knew France intimately, spoke the language perfectly, and had a proven track record of successful operations. The fact that she was an American woman made her even more valuable. Most OSS agents were men who stood out in French villages. Donovan hired her immediately. The OSS commissioned Hall as a second lieutenant, the lowest officer rank. The rank was low and the pay was minimal, barely enough to live on. But Hall didn't care about rank or money. She cared about getting back to work. The OSS had one condition. Hall couldn't go back to France as Virginia Hall. The Gestapo would recognize her within days. She needed a disguise so complete that even people who'd worked with her wouldn't identify her. The OSS would provide the best specialists in the country to create that disguise. Hall spent months working with OSS disguise specialists. They studied photographs of her from various angles, analyzing facial structure and distinctive features. They consulted with makeup artists from Hollywood, who understood how to transform actors into different characters. They brought in costume designers, who knew how clothing could alter perceived age and social class. The transformation was comprehensive. They dyed Hall's hair gray and cut it into a short, severe style that added years to her appearance. They taught her to apply makeup that emphasized wrinkles and created age spots. They filed down her teeth, actually filed the enamel, to mimic the dental work common among poor French peasants who couldn't afford proper dentistry. They changed her posture. Hall naturally stood tall with good posture from years of formal education and diplomatic training. They taught her to hunch her shoulders slightly, bend forward from the waist, and move with the careful stiffness of an older woman with arthritis. The changed posture also altered her gait, making her limp less pronounced but still present. They adjusted Cuthbert. The prosthetic was reconfigured to change the angle of her ankle, producing a different walking pattern. The change made Hall slightly shorter and altered the rhythm of her steps. Someone who knew Virginia Hall's distinctive limp wouldn't recognize the gait of her new identity. Marcelle Montagne, age 60, widow, born in Crest in southeastern France. Marcelle had lived on a small farm her entire life, kept goats and cows, made cheese, never traveled far from home. Her husband had died 5 years earlier. She had no children. She lived alone, which explained why nobody knew her family or history in detail. The document specialists created papers for Marcelle: birth certificate from Crest, marriage certificate, husband's death certificate, identity card issued by Vichy authorities, ration cards, all the papers a French citizen would carry, all perfectly forged, all with appropriate wear and aging. Hall spent weeks practicing being Marcelle. She lived in character constantly, even at OSS training facilities. She spoke with a rural accent, different from her educated Parisian French. She moved like a 60-year-old farm woman with arthritis. She developed Marcelle's personality: cautious, suspicious of strangers, devoutly Catholic, conservative in politics, worried about German requisitions of farm produce. The transformation was tested on former SOE colleagues who'd worked with Hall in London. She walked past them in hallways. She sat near them in cafeterias. She attended training sessions they supervised. Not one recognized her. Virginia Hall had disappeared. Marcelle Montagne existed in her place. On March 21, 1944, Hall returned to France. Her artificial leg prevented parachute jumps. The impact of landing would shatter the prosthetic or break her stump, so she arrived by British motor gunboat. The boat landed her at Béguenefray east of Roscoff in Brittany. The Germans controlled the coast, but small boats regularly evaded their patrols by approaching at night in bad weather. Hall established herself as a farmer in the Haute-Loire region of central France. The area was mountainous, poor, and thinly populated. German presence was minimal compared to cities like Lyon or Paris. The local economy depended on small farms producing cheese, milk, and meat for local consumption. Hall rented a small farm outside the village of Cosne-d'Allier. The farm came with a stone cottage, a barn, and a few acres of pasture. She purchased 3 cows and half a dozen goats, using money the OSS provided. Every morning, she herded the animals to pasture, milked them, and made cheese, using traditional methods she'd learned from OSS training specialists. German soldiers passed her farm regularly. They saw an elderly peasant woman milking cows, making cheese, and tending her animals. They never gave Marcelle Montagne a second glance. Why would they? She was obviously a simple farm woman, uneducated, probably illiterate, no threat to anyone. But Marcelle Montagne was scouting drop zones for supply aircraft. Every field she walked through was assessed for size, drainage, obstacles, and accessibility. Hall marked GPS coordinates, or rather, the 1944 equivalent, compass bearings and distances from known landmarks. She sketched maps showing approach paths, wind direction, and potential hazards. At night, Hall transmitted intelligence reports to London using a wireless radio hidden in her farmhouse. The transmissions were brief, 5 minutes maximum, to avoid German direction-finding equipment. She used codes to compress maximum information into minimum transmission time, drop zone coordinates, German troop movements, supply requirements for local resistance groups, requests for specific weapons and equipment. When supply planes flew over, Hall guided them in with flashlights arranged in patterns visible from the air. The planes dropped supplies in containers attached to parachutes. Hall and teams of WWII fighters would collect the containers before dawn, hiding them in barns and caves before German patrols could investigate. She recruited a new network called Saint. By June 1944, Hall had over 1,500 WWII fighters under her coordination. The WWII were French resistance fighters who lived in the countryside, hiding in forests and mountains, conducting guerrilla operations against German forces. They were brave but poorly trained and desperately under-equipped. Many fought with hunting rifles and homemade explosives. Hall provided them with proper weapons: British Sten submachine guns, American carbines, hand grenades, plastic explosives, and ammunition. She organized training programs, teaching the WWII basic infantry tactics, weapons maintenance, and explosive demolition. She coordinated their operations with Allied military plans, ensuring resistance activities supported larger strategic objectives. She also recruited 3 Jedburgh teams. The Jedburghs were Allied special operations teams, usually 1 British officer, 1 American officer, and 1 French operative, parachuted into France to coordinate resistance operations. The teams were supposed to work independently, but Hall's knowledge of the region and her established networks made her invaluable. She provided intelligence on German positions, identified high-value targets, and coordinated timing with Allied operations. Captain Jean-Claude Guillet commanded one of the Jedburgh teams Hall worked with. After the war, he wrote a report describing Marcel Montaigne as the most effective resistance coordinator he'd encountered. She knew every village, every road, every German patrol pattern. She had sources inside Vichy administrations who provided intelligence on German plans, and she operated with complete security. Guillet worked with her for 3 months before learning that Marcel was actually an American OSS agent. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Hall's networks went into action immediately. According to plans she'd coordinated with London weeks earlier, they destroyed bridges along key supply routes, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches quickly. They derailed freight trains, carrying ammunition and fuel. They cut telephone lines and destroyed radio relay stations, disrupting German communications. One operation Hall coordinated destroyed a major railway bridge over the Loire River near Nevers. The bridge carried supplies from southern France to German forces fighting in Normandy. Hall's team planted explosives at the critical support points and detonated them just as a German freight train was crossing. The train, the bridge, and several hundred tons of ammunition dropped into the river. German engineers estimated repairs would take 3 months. By then, the Normandy campaign would be over. Hall personally led several dangerous operations. On one mission, she infiltrated German headquarters in Chambon-sur-Lignon, disguised as an elderly woman selling cheese door to door. While German officers debated strategy in an adjacent room, Hall memorized troop dispositions from a map visible on the wall. She sold her cheese, pocketed the money, and walked out. That evening, she transmitted the intelligence to London, giving Allied commanders precise information about German defensive positions. On another occasion, Hall posed as a peasant woman whose cow had wandered onto a German airfield, while soldiers helped her catch the cow, which Hall had deliberately let loose near the perimeter fence. She counted aircraft, noted fuel storage locations, and observed guard procedures. 2 nights later, WWII fighters infiltrated the airfield using information Hall provided and destroyed 9 aircraft with explosive charges. The Germans never suspected Marcel Montaigne. The Gestapo was still looking for the limping lady with red hair and an American accent. They never imagined she'd transformed herself into a French grandmother who smelled like goats and complained about rheumatism. By August 1944, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were advancing rapidly toward Paris. Hall's networks had effectively cleared the Haute-Loire region of German forces before American troops arrived. Local resistance had ambushed German convoys, captured isolated garrisons, and forced larger units to retreat northward to avoid encirclement. Hall coordinated operations that killed at least 150 German soldiers, captured over 500 more, and destroyed countless supply shipments, bridges, and communication lines. Her intelligence reports guided Allied tactical planning. Her coordination of resistance groups prevented German forces from establishing effective defensive lines in central France. On September 7, 1944, OSS headquarters ordered Hall out of France. She'd been operating continuously in enemy territory since March. The risk of discovery increased daily as more Allied troops arrived, some of whom might recognize her despite her disguise. General Donovan decided she'd accomplished her mission. Time to extract before luck ran out. Hall returned to London in mid-September. Her second tour in France had lasted 6 months, half as long as her first tour, but arguably more impactful. She'd successfully operated under deep cover in German-occupied territory, built a network from nothing, and coordinated guerrilla operations that directly supported the Normandy invasion and subsequent Allied advance. On September 12, 1945, almost exactly 1 year after her extraction from France, General William Donovan presented Virginia Hall with the Distinguished Service Cross in a private ceremony at OSS headquarters. The DSC was the second highest military decoration the United States could award, given only for extraordinary heroism in military operations against an armed enemy. The citation read, "Despite her disability and the fact that she was well known to the Gestapo, Miss Hall voluntarily returned to France in March 1944 to assist in sabotage operations against the Germans. Through her courage and physical stamina, even though she was crippled, Miss Hall, with 2 American officers, succeeded in organizing, arming, and training 3 FFI battalions, which took part in many engagements with the enemy, contributing materially to the success of the Allied invasion of southern France. Hall was the only civilian woman to receive the Distinguished Service Cross during World War II. The honor recognized not just her courage, but her effectiveness. She'd accomplished what most military commanders considered impossible, operating deep behind enemy lines for extended periods, building networks the Germans couldn't penetrate, and coordinating operations that achieved strategic objectives. President Harry Truman wanted to present the medal publicly at the White House, a ceremony with press coverage, photographs, public recognition for an extraordinary American woman who'd served her country heroically. Hall politely but firmly refused. She didn't want publicity. She wanted to remain anonymous because she planned to continue working in intelligence. Her career wasn't over. The war against Germany might be ending, but the Cold War was already beginning. Hall joined the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency in 1947. The CIA was created from the remnants of the OSS, maintaining many of the same personnel and operating procedures. Hall worked as an intelligence analyst in the Special Activities Division, focusing on French political affairs and Soviet operations in Western Europe. The work was less dramatic than wartime operations, but still important. Hall analyzed Soviet intelligence activities, tracked communist infiltration of French labor unions, and monitored political developments that could affect American interests. She brought the same meticulous attention to detail she'd applied to resistance operations in France. In 1950, Hall married Paul Goyot, a former French OSS operative she'd worked with during the war. Goyot had fought with the resistance before joining the OSS as a liaison officer. He understood Hall's work because he'd done similar work himself. They built a partnership based on mutual respect and shared experiences that most people couldn't comprehend. Hall and Goyot both worked for the CIA until mandatory retirement in 1966. Hall retired at age 60 after 24 years in intelligence work. She'd served longer than most male officers and achieved more than officers who received far more recognition. But intelligence work doesn't reward publicity seekers. The best officers are the ones nobody knows about. Hall retired to a farm in Barnesville, Maryland, not far from where she'd grown up. She and Paul lived quietly, maintaining contact with old colleagues, but generally avoiding attention. Hall refused all interviews. When journalists approached her for stories about her wartime service, she declined politely but firmly. When historians requested interviews for books about SOE or OSS, she referred them to official records and refused personal participation. The CIA tried to honor her publicly several times. They wanted to feature her in recruitment materials, hold ceremonies, recognizing her achievements, and use her story to demonstrate what dedicated officers could accomplish. Hall refused every time. She'd spent her career staying invisible. She wasn't going to become visible in retirement. Virginia Hall died on July 8, 1982, at age 76. She'd lived long enough to see the Cold War wind down, see the CIA evolve from its OSS origins, and see women gradually gain recognition in intelligence work. She was buried in a small cemetery in Maryland, with a simple headstone that listed her name, birth and death dates, and nothing else. No mention of medals, operations, or the fact that she'd been the most dangerous Allied spy of World War II. Only after her death did the full extent of her achievements become public. CIA historians went through classified files and released reports describing her operations. WWII records declassified in Britain provided additional details. French resistance members who'd worked with her wrote memoirs identifying the mysterious American woman who'd coordinated their operations. Slowly, piece by piece, Virginia Hall's story emerged from decades of secrecy. The Gestapo called her the most dangerous spy. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, put her face on wanted posters across France and made capturing her a personal mission. German intelligence officers studied her methods for years, trying to understand how one woman with a wooden leg could organize networks they couldn't penetrate and coordinate operations they couldn't prevent. The secret was simple but difficult to execute. Virginia Hall succeeded because she refused to accept limitations others tried to impose on her. The State Department told her she couldn't be a diplomat because of her disability. She became a spy instead. The British told her she couldn't survive in occupied France because she was too conspicuous. She survived for 15 months and became a legend. The Germans told themselves she couldn't escape over the Pyrenees in winter with one leg. She walked 50 miles through snow and ice and emerged free on the other side. WWII told her she couldn't return to France because the Gestapo knew her face. She changed her face and went back anyway. Hall's story reveals something essential about what made certain individuals effective in clandestine operations. Success wasn't about being invisible. Hall was inherently memorable because of her disability. Success came from being adaptive, disciplined, and absolutely committed to mission accomplishment, regardless of personal cost. The cost was real and ongoing. Hall lived with constant pain from Cuthbert. The prosthetic never fit properly despite adjustments and modifications. The leather straps chafed her skin raw every day. The stump bled and blistered from long days of walking. Going upstairs was agony. Going downstairs risked serious falls. Cold weather made everything worse, turning Cuthbert into an instrument of torture. But she never complained and never let the pain slow her operations. She also paid an enormous psychological cost. Hall spent years living under constant threat of capture, knowing the Gestapo would torture and execute her if caught. She maintained perfect operational security 24 hours a day for months at a time, knowing one mistake could compromise networks and kill everyone who'd worked with her. The stress of that responsibility would have broken most people. Hall internalized it and kept working. After the war, Hall refused to talk about her experiences, possibly because reliving them was too painful. She'd seen people tortured and killed. She'd made decisions that sent agents into situations where some didn't return. She'd walked past German soldiers every day, knowing they'd kill her if they discovered her identity. Processing those experiences required compartmentalizing them so completely that even decades later, she couldn't open those compartments without risking psychological damage. Yet Hall's legacy extends far beyond her individual achievements. She proved that women could serve effectively as combat operatives in the most dangerous environments imaginable. Before Hall and other female SOE agents, the British War Cabinet had forbidden women from frontline roles, assuming they couldn't handle the physical or psychological demands. Hall demonstrated that courage, intelligence, and operational effectiveness weren't determined by gender. She also proved that disability didn't disqualify someone from extraordinary service. The State Department rejected her because they couldn't imagine an amputee serving effectively as a diplomat. SOE and OSS looked past her disability and saw her capabilities, language skills, intelligence, determination, and willingness to take calculated risks. They were rewarded with one of the most effective agents of the entire war. The fact that Hall accomplished all this while dealing with a crude 1940s prosthetic makes her achievements even more remarkable. Modern prosthetics are sophisticated devices with microprocessors, adjustable joints, and materials designed for comfort. Cuthbert was a wooden peg with an aluminum foot, held on by leather straps, incapable of flexing or absorbing shock. Walking across a room was work. Walking 50 miles over the Pyrenees was nearly superhuman. In 2017, the Central Intelligence Agency named a training facility in her honor. The Virginia Hall Expeditionary Center trains modern intelligence officers in the same skills Hall used during the war, operating under deep cover, recruiting and running agents, building networks in hostile territory, and maintaining operational security in environments where discovery means death. The facility includes a museum section with artifacts from Hall's career, her Distinguished Service Cross, false identity papers, photographs showing her transformation into Marcel Montaigne, and a replica of Cuthbert, the 8-pound wooden leg that accompanied her through operations across 2 continents. The irony is that Hall would have hated the recognition. She spent her entire career avoiding attention, maintaining cover, and keeping her work secret. She believed intelligence officers should be invisible. The best spies are the ones nobody knows about. Public recognition contradicted everything she'd learned about operational security, but her story deserves to be remembered precisely because it was hidden for so long. Virginia Hall walked through occupied France organizing networks that helped win the war. When the Gestapo closed in, she hiked 50 miles over winter mountains to freedom, bleeding and in agony every step of the way. Then she disguised herself as an elderly peasant woman and went back to continue the fight. She operated behind enemy lines for over 21 months total, longer than almost any other Allied agent survived in France. The Germans called her the most dangerous spy. They were right, but they never understood why. It wasn't her training, though she had excellent training. It wasn't her networks, though she built remarkable networks. It wasn't even her courage, though she had courage in abundance. What made Virginia Hall dangerous was her absolute refusal to accept defeat. The State Department rejected her. The hunting accident crippled her. The Pyrenees tried to kill her. The Gestapo hunted her. None of it mattered. She kept working, kept fighting, and kept winning until the war was over, and then kept serving until mandatory retirement forced her to stop. 50 miles over the Pyrenees with one leg. 3 days of walking through snow and ice with a wooden prosthetic that tore her flesh with every step. Most people would call it impossible. Hall called it necessary and kept walking until she reached Spain. That's the measure of Virginia Hall's determination. That's why the Gestapo feared her, and that's why her story, finally emerging from decades of secrecy, continues to inspire everyone who learns about the invisible warrior who refused to quit. If you found this story of courage, determination, and invisible heroism compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to World War II Archives to stay connected with history that matters. The extraordinary individuals whose stories deserve to be remembered, even when they tried to remain anonymous. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and which part of Virginia Hall's story inspired you most. Thank you for watching and for remembering the invisible warriors who changed the world.